Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the fourth weekend of August 2025. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Established in 2019 by the Franklin News Foundation, the Center Square publishes original taxpayer-centric straight news that focuses on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories, adding insights to the headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist. Today, we'll discuss President Trump's meeting with the presidents of Russia and Ukraine. We'll look at the latest on Trump's effort to curb crime in Washington, D.C., and we'll hear about Trump's push to end mail-in ballots. Be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Teacher Lauren Johnson returned all the graded essays but one. He believed that one student was capable of more.
I don't believe taking the middle of the road is your philosophy. This time, write something you really believe.
The student wrote a new one about excellence. Instead of just grading an essay, Mr. Johnson changed a life. I am that student. I became a writer, and I wrote this to thank him.
Thank a teacher and pass it on from passiton.com.
Tired of news that tells you what to think rather than what to think about? At the Center Square, we bring you the reliable, credible news you need focused on what actually matters: government accountability, taxes, and the decisions affecting your community. Our award-winning newsroom cuts through the noise to deliver fact-driven journalism you can trust. Stay informed. Visit thecentersquare.com today and subscribe. Once again, that is thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on Russia and Ukraine, it's our Dan McCaleb.
President Donald Trump has tried to broker a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine, meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin last week in Alaska, and Ukraine President Zelensky and other European leaders this week at the White House. So far, it doesn't appear that those talks have led to much progress, with Russia striking deep inside of Ukraine with missile and drone attacks Wednesday that has also slammed an American-owned manufacturing plant. Joining me to discuss this is the Center Square White House reporter, Morgan Sweeney. Morgan, where are we at with negotiations?
Hi, Dan. So negotiations don't look incredibly promising at this point. Putin did meet with Trump in Alaska on Friday, as you mentioned, which was a big deal. There was a lot of anticipation there with how that meeting could go. Putin had not been in the U.S. for 10 years at that point, and it was a long time since he had met with President Biden. So the meeting, it's kind of unclear how it went. We don't really have a ton of insight into it even now. They did a bilateral press conference afterward, Putin and Trump, and Putin said an agreement had been made. Trump made it clear, though, that there were other things that needed to be discussed and agreed to before a deal was likely going to come out of it. And it was very vague at that time. But President Zelensky and other European leaders came to the White House on Monday to talk things over with Trump at that point, after he had met with Putin, about some kind of peaceful resolution to the end of this war. Where can they go from here? And things like that. Zelensky has indicated that he is willing to meet with President Putin in person. But he's also looking for security guarantees from the U.S. and from some of these European countries. And then Zelensky and these European leaders met with Trump, discussed things with him on Monday. And then Trump afterward called President Putin, and Putin said that he was open to a meeting with Zelensky. But that was earlier this week. And as you said, Russia conducted some attacks on Ukraine in that time, even while Zelensky and these other European leaders were still here, which isn't really a good look for how things are going to go. And Zelensky and Putin have yet to agree on a city where they're going to meet. And Putin kind of seems less willing to do that now. So
those security guarantees that President Zelensky is looking for, and that Putin seemed open to. It does not include Ukraine joining NATO, but President Trump did seem to commit that to U.S. Air Force help in defending Ukraine, though he said no way to boots on the ground. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And that was something that was a little unclear as well. On Monday, a reporter asked him, is boots on the ground something that you're willing to consider? And he gave an answer that wasn't super definitive. But then later in the week, he clarified he's not open to boots on the ground at all. But yes, he would consider lending air support. I think he said, especially because America has, planes and things that other countries don't have.
One of the key sticking points seems to be that Putin wants to annex Crimea and other lands that it controls right now after its invasion of Ukraine. And President Zelensky indicates he is not willing to allow Russia to annex parts of Ukraine. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Mm-hmm. So Russia illegally invaded Crimea years ago. And has since occupied that territory. And even though the international community recognizes it still as part of Ukraine, Russia is there. And so that is something that Putin wants to retain control of. And he wants, it's believed that he wants international recognition, like now this is a part of Russia. And then Putin is also pushing for Ukraine to cede its Donbas region, which includes a couple Ukrainian states that Russia has invaded on the eastern side. It's where most of the fighting has occurred, and Russia has been able to kind of dominate about 70% of that area at this point. And Putin is saying, I want the whole thing. And I want it to be a part of Russia from here on out. And Zelensky obviously doesn't want to do that. So
the next step, it seems to be, was Trump trying to get Zelensky and Putin in the same room together with him to negotiate a ceasefire and hopefully a peace agreement. That has yet to happen. How do you see that happening anytime soon?
Well, it's just really hard to predict with somebody like Putin. I think even Trump, who, knows him personally, has a difficult time predicting what he's going to do, because he can say one thing and then sort of do the opposite in the same day. So I think it may happen soon, just because of kind of the international pressure. And personally, I think Putin wants to keep up appearances to some degree. But it's very hard to see Putin kind of making any real concessions, over time. So I think that's the difficult part.
Thank you for joining us today, Morgan. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Dan and Morgan. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the situation in D.C., let's go to Morgan Sweeney.
We are now well into the second week of President Donald Trump's Liberation Day operation in Washington, D.C., where he deployed National Guard troops to combat crime in the city. The White House this week touted police union statistics showing crime significantly down since the operation began. Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser and other Democrats have been highly critical of the deployment. Joining me to discuss this is the Center Square's Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief, Sarah Roderick Fitch. Sarah, tell us more about what the White House is saying about the crime data.
Well, they continue to show that the data showing that crime is significantly down, and these past now almost 2 weeks that since quote Liberation Day, as President Trump calls it, showing that I think there were some new figures just released, but it's showing that like carjackings, for instance, are down by 83%. A lot of significant drops in all the crime and all crime areas. Including property theft and I guess assaults and everything. So it is showing that it is having having a significant impact. Not exactly sure if it's just based on arrest, of getting people off the streets, or if it's just sort of a deterrent to, crimes ongoing, potentially, people committing future crimes. We don't really know at this point.
So Trump joined military and law enforcement on Thursday with a large group of them gathered, just thanking them for the job that they're doing, affirming that he believes it's necessary, having them there. What did he have to say to them then?
He thanked them for what they were doing. He talked about the importance of what they have been doing and the impact that they are making, showing that, hey, this is working, appears to be working. Other cities are sort of looking at this going, okay, obviously this is working. Even some Democrats are, it's kind of undeniable. Hey, this is going on. This seems to be working. But yeah, he went to, I believe it was the Park Police headquarters, and because Park Police is a major part of this. Park Police oversees the mall, and a lot of different areas, Rock Creek Park, a lot of areas within the district they have a lot of jurisdiction over. So they are sort of a very important component to this patrolling. And so it's really interesting. He went there, but he was also Vice President Vance did something similar. He went with Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, to Union Station. They met with National Guard members, they shared a meal with them. They did all that. They had some good words. But as that was happening, now Trump did not see this, but obviously it was a little bit more apparent when Vance was there. There was a lot of pushback. There were a lot of protests. There were people inside Union Station shouting, calling him a Nazi and so forth, and shouting some profanities at the Vice President and Secretary Hegseth as they were going through. So there is quite a bit of pushback and protests that are ongoing. But interestingly, people on the ground there it's Union Station was sort of a hotbed. There was a lot of homelessness around there, and there were a lot of sometimes violence could break out there, and that's been pushed out. People have noted, hey, they don't smell weed, when they're coming out of Union Station, they're not approached. And so it's interesting to kind of see how this is sort of transpired. But I do think it's going to continue on. But the DC Police Union, they have been sort of at the forefront of this whole thing. They've been putting out some of these stats and whatnot, and they're just sort of saying, hey, this is just sort of the first, this is just the first sort of step in this, and they want real reforms, and starting with the DC Council. So I think it'll be really interesting. I think right now this is sort of the first step in what's ongoing, but the fight is going to continue. And I think when Congress comes back into session, that's when things are going to maybe get a little bit more tense, and there's going to be a little bit more debate going on between the Democrats and Republicans, because I think this is going to be an opportunity for the Trump administration and Senator Mike Lee, who has been really the big one behind this whole rescinding the Home Rule Act for DC. I think there's going to be a major push to sort of get that through in order to get reforms as far as the justice system within DC, because that's right there, kind of a barrier. And U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro has mentioned that, especially with the youth crime, is sort of it's kind of a revolving door, because they can't really prosecute. They can just sort of slap the wrist of some of these teens that were behind a lot of these carjackings. And so I think that it'll be interesting to see what's coming from it. But I think that there is going to be a major fight, and that's going to come down to rescinding this. And it'll be interesting. There's going to be all eyes on it as, hey, there's going to be a fight over DC statehood. Then there's going to be, the fight over giving DC its autonomy and continuing to give it its autonomy. And so we'll see kind of what happens. But I think the next few weeks, there's going to be a real push to rescind that DC Home Rule Act on Republican side. And then on Democratic side, it's going to be a push to make DC a 51st state. Right now, it's sort of the calm before the storm, I think, in DC.
Has the administration given a clear timeline for when the federalization of DC is going to end, or what have they said there?
No, they have not given a timeline as far as how long the National Guard will be there. I mean, based on what it was in 2021, there were National Guard members there from January until about May. There were thousands of National Guard members. There is no absolute timeline, especially with the DC National Guard. And interestingly, there's no price tag either. Reached out to the DoD, and they didn't have a figure until after this mission is complete. So it's no telling how long this is going to be ongoing. But as far as The police officers, the federalization, there are almost 36 federal law enforcement agencies that do have some jurisdiction within the district. So really that's nothing new. They can operate around their Secret Service Uniform Division, Capitol Police. They have some jurisdiction beyond just the Capitol, and beyond that they can go around. So Park Police obviously is another one, Amtrak Police, Metro Police, Smithsonian has their own police. All those places, they have there's different jurisdictions around the district. So some of them, there's also Federal Protective Services and all these other U.S. Marshals and whatnot. So, I mean, they can already be there. They can be doing that stuff. So that issue's not with them. I think it's more the National Guard and how long they'll be there. But yeah, there's no timeline. And the White House has said, they've said however long this is going to take. So I don't know if they're thinking until they can get this new law, or until they're sort of seeing any sort of change, maybe winter. I don't know. Generally crime sometimes has a way of going down in winter times. So we'll just see from here. We'll see. But yeah, it's sort of an open-ended commitment at this time.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us today, Sarah. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Morgan and Sarah. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on mail-in ballots, let's now go back to Dan McCaleb.
President Trump said this week that he wants to abolish mail-in voting and electronic voting machines. Trump said the changes would restore election integrity and, quote, help bring honesty to the 2026 midterm elections. Democrats said he can't do that. Joining me to discuss this is the Center Square's congressional reporter, Therese Boudreau. Therese, tell us more about what Trump said this week.
Yeah, so Trump posted a very long post on Truth Social, the social media platform, and he said that he is going to lead a movement beginning with an executive order to abolish mail-in voting and electronic voting machines. And so obviously there's been a lot of surprise, or maybe not surprise, more like upheaval about that. He argues that mail-in voting is insecure. He claims that it has led to massive fraud. There's no proof of that, but that's, a talking point that he's been on for a while. So he says it's less secure. And then for the voting machines, the electronic voting machines, which there are some to where voters, they're not very common. There's about 98% of polling locations have a kind of machine, if they do it all, where you put the paper ballot that a voter filled out in the machine and it counts it. But there are some voting machines where it's all completely electronic. And there actually have been security concerns with that in the past by the U.S. Elections Commission. Again, no proof of fraud, but basically, hey, this isn't the most secure way to do it. And so he wants to target both of those. And there's been some agreement among Republican lawmakers for him. But it's unclear how exactly he would do that, because he can't just put out an executive order saying, hey, all states and localities can no longer do mail-in voting or electronic voting machines, because the Constitution's elections clause says that states and localities, local governments are the ones who can essentially figure out how they want to carry out the elections process. So the times, manner, and places, it says, are what the states can dictate on their own. So it's unclear how Trump will be able to do that, but apparently he's going to start the process with an executive order.
Therese, while some states have had widespread mail-in voting for over a decade, it really expanded nationwide during the COVID-19 pandemic. Previous to that, there was absentee voting for people who just couldn't get to the polling place on election day, for veterans who were stationed overseas or elsewhere, things like that. But really it was 2020. The 2020 election is when mail-in voting expanded, and most states have not really gone back from that. Trump says that, as you mentioned, Trump says that can lead to widespread fraud, ballot dumping, someone gathering a bunch of ballots and putting them in there. There have been samples of that occurring and people being arrested across the country, but not widespread. So I can see the arguments here both ways. But if the elections clause, as you pointed out, says that it's in the state's hands to determine how the voting, even if an executive order from President Trump isn't going to work, can Congress do anything about that? Or what happens next, I guess?
Yes, they can actually. So Congress can pass a law, the Constitution says, that changes how things are done with the election. So Congress can pass a law telling states that they can't do mail-in ballots or mail-in voting. But and that's not going to happen, though, at least with this 119th Congress, because even though Republicans do have control of both chambers, there's no way they're going to pass the filibuster in the Senate. Republicans have 53 people in the Senate. They need 60 votes. And Democrats have come out on social media and elsewhere saying that, there's no way this is going to get past them. They're not going to let any ban or restriction on mail-in ballots or voting or electronic voting machines pass Congress. So it really does raise the question, okay, how is it going to work then? There could be some Republican states, especially those that have already been wanting to crack down on the massive expansion of absentee and mail-in voting, like you said, that happened during COVID and then kind of remained in a lot of states after COVID. So he could, this is all just speculation, but maybe he could sign some executive orders saying that states who do this, are eligible for a special election fund or something like that, have more of like an incentive. Or there could just be some, red states who do it so that, it makes President Trump happy, or maybe they've been wanting to do this for a while. So this gives them, a good precedent, a good excuse to do that. It's difficult to see how this could be, if there's any kind of change like this, how it could be anything other than voluntary, on the state's part. Because again, given the president's lack of power in this and given the makeup of Congress, it just doesn't seem possible that states and localities who do not want to do this are going to do this. Again, which is maybe why President Trump said he's going to, quote, lead a movement. So there might be a really big, pressure campaign. We could see a lot of stuff. He didn't really give a bunch of details. The majority of the post was about, the scam that it is, that he said, or the massive fraud that's been enabled, all of these claims that he's made. But it is interesting because, the electronic voting machines, like I said, there are a lot of bipartisan concerns with those. The U.S. Elections Commission actually unanimously voted in May to recommend that all, polling places have some kind of paper trail, that they don't just use fully electronic voting machines, that you can't trace any ballots. You don't have people hand filling things. You don't have, some ballot going into a machine. It's all just electronic. They recommend that, just against that, because it's difficult to track at that point. We'll see. President Donald Trump makes announcements like this all the time, where he just puts something on social media and says, we're going to do this. And then, we all just wonder, all right, let's try to figure out how he plans to accomplish that. But, in the coming weeks, see what that executive order is about.
Therese, thank you for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thanks to Dan and Therese. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. Why is the Washington State Attorney General facing scrutiny? How did some Virginia schools respond to the Department of Education finding them in violation of Title IX? And is the U.S. economy headed for stagflation? We'll look at all of that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here are this week's quick hits, some of the original reporting you may have missed at thecentersquare.com. The U.S. Department of Agriculture will no longer subsidize large-scale solar projects placed on farmland or use solar panels manufactured by foreign adversaries in any agency project. Hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars have gone towards solar and other green energy initiatives since 2022 alone. Roughly 47% of utility-scale solar projects are located on farmland, according to Agricultural Economic Insights, and solar panels on American farmland have increased by 50% since 2012. USDA Secretary Brooke Rollins said America's prime farmland should not be wasted and replaced with Green New Deal subsidized solar panels. The Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction's changes to its 1 through 5-star school ratings leave parents unclear on local school performance, according to a report by the Institute for Reforming Government. The rating system assesses the performance of schools and districts for the public to see how schools are performing and where improvements may be needed. However, the Institute for Reforming Government said, just like last year, no district will receive a 1-star rating, even if they are considered underperforming. As partisan redistricting battles play out in Texas and California, Ohio is under a rule of the people to change congressional maps before the midterm elections. Per a constitutional amendment passed by voters in 2018, congressional districts drawn without bipartisan support from the Ohio Redistricting Commission must be redrawn every 4 years. In 2020, the commission approved the maps favoring 10 Republican and 5 Democratic seats. According to Ohio State Minority Leader Nikki J. Antonio, a Democrat from Lakewood, the maps for the 2026 midterm congressional elections could make the split 8-7 in favor of the GOP. An internet trade group filed a lawsuit against Colorado challenging a new law that would require social media platforms to regularly send pop-up notifications to minors using their sites. NetChoice argued that this is a government attack on free speech and asked the U.S. District Court for the District of Colorado to declare the bill unlawful. The legislation in question would require social media platforms to display a pop-up notification every 30 minutes to any user who is under 18, has been on the platform for 1 cumulative hour during a 24-hour period, and is on the platform between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. Paul Task, co-director of the NetChoice Litigation Center, told the Center Square in an exclusive interview that the government should have no role in forcing social media to speak on its behalf. During a Phoenix school board meeting, member Jeremiah Cota was quickly shut down for saying the Lord's Prayer rather than an indigenous land acknowledgement. In an exclusive interview with the Center Square, Cota, who represents Ward 1 on the Phoenix Union High School District Governing Board, recounted his experience at the August board meeting. The board member highlighted the fact that these land acknowledgements, statements by organizations that recognize it is on land that historically was inhabited by indigenous peoples, are treated like a religious prayer. Cota, a member of the Free People of the San Carlos Apache tribe, grew up on an American Indian reservation. Cota said that land acknowledgements are not appropriate at board meetings and said it is simply virtue signaling. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
He ran for state office and was beaten. Started a business and failed. Ran for Congress and lost. But thankfully, Abraham Lincoln didn't give up. Persistence. Pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life at values.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on the Washington State Attorney General, it's Tim Clouser.
I'm here with the Center Square's investigative reporter, TJ Martinell. Here to talk about one of his recent stories. Apparently, the Washington State Attorney General, Nick Brown, was recently threatened with interim suspension of his license to practice law, specifically for failing to respond to allegations made in response to TJ's reporting about an amicus brief that the AGO filed in support of a law firm called Perkins Coie. TJ, there's a lot to unpack here, a lot of technicalities in terms of the legal world. Why don't you break it down for the everyday reader?
Yeah, I'll keep it simple. The Attorney General's office filed what's called an amicus brief in support of Perkins Coie's lawsuit against President Trump's executive orders. Those executive orders canceled their federal contracts and also revoked their security clearance. An amicus brief is effectively a third party that's not involved in the litigation saying, acting as a friend of the court and just providing background information on the case. And so the problem is that there was numerous potential unethical behavior involved with the amicus brief, one of which is the Attorney General's office has 10 active contracts with Perkins Coie that it didn't disclose. So it's not exactly a neutral party. So there was an ethical complaint filed against Brown because he signed the amicus brief. And the State Bar Association sent him a letter saying, hey, we haven't made a decision, but we need you to respond to these allegations. And by the deadline, he did not respond. So they sent him another letter saying, hey, we haven't gotten anything from you. You need to respond because we can subpoena you. And it could ultimately result in you losing your license to practice law for an interim period. He did not respond for another month. And the response was the day after I reached out to the State Bar Association for a story I was working on about this. And even then, Nick Brown did not actually respond. The person who responded on his behalf was Noah Purcell, who's the Solicitor General, and he helped write the amicus brief. And he also used to work at Perkins Coie. So there's a lot going on where there's just a lot of weird behavior. One, Nick Brown is having the Solicitor General respond on his behalf. Number two, they're using public resources to defend him in a private matter because the State Bar Association inquiry is about Nick Brown as a private attorney. So he's using public tax dollars not only to help a private law firm keep their federal contracts, they're now using public resources and taxpayer dollars to defend him in a private State Bar Association inquiry. So that's effectively where things are at right now. There's more potentially on the horizon, but I've contacted and been in contact with attorneys throughout the country, and they are completely in disbelief about this. This doesn't happen. And according to the State Bar Association, there's no known instance of where they've ever launched an inquiry into a sitting attorney general. Now, granted, if the inquiry doesn't launch a formal investigation, and we're not at that point yet with this, all the records get destroyed after 3 years. So if there was an instance, we don't know about it, but I don't think that it's very, very likely this has never happened before. This is unprecedented in Washington state history.
So, and this comes back to your prior reporting where, like you were saying, you essentially uncovered that Perkins Coie is suing the Trump administration and the AGO is filing this amicus brief, supposed to be a neutral party, but it didn't disclose all of these cases that it's working with Perkins Coie in. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong here, to again sue the Trump administration.
Yeah, and that's the other interesting thing is, Nick, the amicus brief is not in support of a lawsuit that concerns Washington state residents. So the Attorney General is the client of the state of Washington and, which is also residents. So he's tasked with defending Washington state law. There's no public interest or interest of the state itself that Perkins Coie has access to a security clearance of federal contracts. And they from what I understand, there's a substantial amount in that regard. So that's the issue of why is the Attorney General's office getting involved? And not to connect the dots too much, but like I said, Noah Purcell worked at Perkins Coie. He helped write the amicus brief. He drafted it, but he didn't actually sign it. Nick Brown signed it along with, I think it was 3 other deputy solicitor generals. Yet when there's an ethics inquiry launched against Brown, it's Noah Purcell who responds. And so it really makes you wonder who the ethics complaint should have been filed against, and also whether or not the inquiry by the State Bar Association is going to accept a letter sent from someone else, because Noah Purcell cannot be acting as his attorney in this regard, because he's not being defended as the Attorney General. This inquiry does not concern him in his position as the Attorney General. They obviously can't remove him from office. In that regard, they can just suspend his license to practice law.
So is the question hanging in the air whether or not Purcell was kind of pushing this on his own accord using that's Brown's signature?
What's very possible is that this was Noah Purcell's idea that Nick Brown went along with, and then Brown just signed it, right? He didn't bother reading, or he may have read, but just wasn't thinking about it. And because he's got more than 30 lawsuits now in 8 months filed against Trump. So when he gets slapped with an ethics inquiry, I can imagine his attitude would be, this is not my problem. This is not something I wanted to be involved. I'm not the one who came up with the idea of getting involved in this. So it's interesting that Noah Purcell is responding on his behalf, and we can only wonder, it's very likely that there's going to be ethics complaints filed against Purcell himself, because there's other ethical issues going on here.
Well, anyone that wants to catch this story in prior coverage on this in future installments, be sure to check out thecentersquare.com and all of TJ Martinell's reporting there.
A big thanks to Tim and TJ. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on gender policies in Virginia schools, let's now go to Eliana Kernodle.
Some schools in Northern Virginia have decided to keep their gender policies despite the U.S. Department of Education finding that those policies violate Title IX. Joining me to tell us more about this is the Center Square's education reporter, Esther Wickham. Esther, can you tell us a little bit about these schools and their decision?
Yeah, thanks, Eliana. So Virginia Public Schools in Loudoun County voted this past month that they are going to keep their gender policies, allowing transgender students in their facilities, despite the U.S. Department of Education finding, these policies are violating Title IX, which Title IX, is protects girls against sex discrimination, and it allows the sex-separated spaces are required by federally funded school campuses. So, this is something that the U.S. Department of Education has found not only Loudoun County, but also 4 other public schools in violation of in Northern Virginia. And after, this story was reported on, it was found that not only Loudoun County, but also Fairfax County, Prince William Public School, Arlington Public School, and Alexandria City Public School will be defending their transgender policy, even though the Trump administration has required action to be taken and to change that policy. The U.S. Department of Education said on July 25th, so last month, that they want these schools to enter into a resolution agreement. And the department gave each school 10 days to change the policy. And obviously, right now, they haven't decided to do that. They've decided to keep their gender policies. And this is, for example, access to bathrooms, access to locker rooms, and competing in women's sports or even male sports. And this is something that these schools want to prioritize. This is not the first time, we've talked a lot about other states and other schools prioritizing this. For example, California has decided to also reject that policy. And we saw the Trump administration came after them with cutting federal funding. And so the Trump administration hasn't taken action as of yet, but according to the federal law, these sex-separated spaces are required if the school is federally funded. And so because these specific public schools are federally funded, even Loudoun County, by rejecting this compliance, could lose almost $46 million in federal funds that may be cut. So still waiting to hear back on the Trump administration, since Loudoun County and these other public schools have rejected this policy. The governor of Virginia, Glenn Youngkin, said that this investigation aligns with what many parents have had concerns over the past year. And, he released a statement saying that these school divisions have been violating federal law, deliberately neglecting their responsibility to protect students' safety, privacy, and dignity. And so, again, this kind of goes back to the idea of, what does Title IX say? What do those 37 words actually mean? And a few weeks ago, I actually reported on a webinar that had many, legal experts talk about, what does that interpretation of Title IX mean? How has that changed? What has that looked like throughout each administration, whether it be they're Republican or Democrat? And when speaking with one of those people in this story, Sarah Parshall-Perry, she's a vice president and legal fellow for Defending Education. On a call, she kind of told me, once there is clarity and once there is a clear definition from the U.S. Supreme Court to kind of, put that down, the law of the land, there's clear and clean black letter text of what this civil rights law states. This kind of battle between definitions and interpretation will change. And going further into that, a lot of parents who support these transgender students on the opposite side, or who even have transgender students, are saying that the Trump administration is encouraging, kind of comparing it to to Black segregation, saying that these gender policies are trying to keep students safe in these spaces, and from barring these transgender students from these spaces and from these facilities are the same as keeping Black people from white spaces. And so when speaking with Sarah, she kind of dug into that a little bit more, and this is what she had to say.
Race is not like transgender status, and we have never held that it is. It is not a subject of individuals, a class of individuals that is subject to heightened or intermediate scrutiny that would require sort of a closer constitutional look. That is not something the court has ever held in over 100 years of jurisprudence. And they have, in fact, turned down an opportunity more than once to recognize so-called additional suspect classes. They were asked to recognize poverty as a suspect class. The Supreme Court said no. They were asked to recognize mental disability as a suspect class. The Supreme Court said no. They are going to be asked in the fall to recognize transgender status as a suspect class. And I would be willing to bet money that yet again, the Supreme Court is going to say no. But we will finally get clarification on that answer in the series of women's sports cases currently pending on petitions for review at the Supreme Court right now.
When talking with Perry later on in the interview, she kind of talked about how it's not segregation to bar these, as she states, biological males wanting to be in women's bathrooms. They're not the same. It's not the same as segregation in not allowing people to drink from the same water fountain or be in the same lunch space or ride the same bus, right? You know, she says they're two completely different calculuses. And at the end of the day, she believes it does a disservice to Black Americans who have worked so hard to guarantee equality and not even just in education, but also public accommodation.
Well, Esther, thank you for your insights on this story. You can follow this story and other reporting at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Esther. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Joining me to dig into stagflation, it's PhD economist Dr. Orphe Divounguy.
The economic environment that we're in right now is causing concern that we are headed towards stagflation among some. Let's just talk about what that is and what the impacts of that might be.
Yeah, look, it's rare, right? It's one of those phenomenons where you basically have a slowdown in economic growth. We're kind of there already. Economic growth is basically half of what it was last year in the first half of this year. And the economic growth could even turn negative. The unemployment rate rises. Well, we're not quite there yet, but we will be. And economic activity contracts, right? At the same time, you have persistent inflation. Prices continue to rise across the economy. And so people say, well, hold on a second. How could prices rise when at the same time you have a slowing economy? Well, remember supply and demand from your basic economics class. An increase in demand, right? A shift in the demand curve to the right raises the price level. Well, you could also get a price increase when you shift the supply stuff to the left.
What's happening is you're creating a gap between those two points.
Well, if you basically have less supply, but a bunch of demand, exactly, you get this, the gap between real GDP and nominal GDP, you get price inflation is the difference.
Let's just pause for a second and talk about gross domestic product. Because, stagflation versus a recession. It seems like these big, heavy terms come dropping in every so often, and I don't know if it's just economists trying to make headlines, but there was recession talk ahead of the tariff implementations, right? Now we're talking about stagflation. A recession would be negative GDP growth over 2 quarters, correct?
It's not just that. It's a contracting economic activity. It's an increase in the unemployment rate. It's really determined by the National Bureau of Economic Research. But yeah, traditionally we just looked at GDP growth, but it's more than that. It's more than negative GDP growth. And we know why, because we've seen it in the past play itself out in the past first quarter of each year now, like with the tariffs, imports, trades issues, right? But ultimately, that's it. And when we have stagflation, it's worse. It's even worse because usually in a recession, you get a decline in aggregate demand. The Fed can easily stimulate demand. Fiscal policy can easily, you know why we stimulate demand? You give a bunch of money and put money in people's hands. And what do? They go out and spend. You cut interest rates. You send checks to people, to families. They go out and spend. You stimulate demand. It's very easy to get people to go out and spend.
So the average American understands the stimulus part of it. I get a check.
Or I get a bunch of 0% credit cards in the mail, right?
Right. Yes.
And I go and spend, right? Very easy to do that. What happens in stagflationary scenarios is because prices are rising rapidly, right? Because you don't have a lot of supply, you can't stimulate demand. Because if I stimulate demand, I push inflation higher. I put more pressure on the price level. And so what do you do? The Fed can't cut interest rates in that situation because it will stimulate demand, right? And what you need to get producers to produce more stuff. You need to increase the economic potential, right? How do we do that? We do that by increasing the number of workers in the workforce, right? Example, right? If you have more workers in the workforce, well, you know, and you have more jobs, you can go ahead and build more widgets and the price of widgets goes down, right? Or at least increases at a much slower pace. And I took the example of my landscaper shows up today. He's like, look, I got plenty of capital. I can buy a bunch of new trucks. I can expand.
He has labor issues.
He's got labor issues, right? He's got major labor issues. And, you know, and that's the problem. Our nation is getting older. We have a 4.2% unemployment rate. We need more labor, right? And we need an increase in labor supply in order to meet demand where it's at.
And 4%, I mean, for the benefit of the people that are, you know, that are listening at home and don't track statistics, we would consider that pretty close to full employment, right? 4% unemployment.
Historically, 4.1, 4.2% unemployment rate is very low. And it's very low because we just don't have, well, right now the labor market's frozen. Hiring is frozen. But at the same time, you know, a lot of the downward pressure on wages we got in the last couple of years, right? That the reason inflation's been able to come down is because we had a big increase in labor supply, right? But if you take away these workers, if your population shrinks, right, or your young worker population shrinks, you end up with the unemployment rate won't rise a lot, but you're basically in an economic stagnation. And we don't want to go there. But it seems we're heading there, right? Where it seems we're heading. Everything's kind of frozen right now. And yet prices are rising. And we're getting closer and closer to 3%. We are above 3%, I think, core inflation.
I think it's 3.1.
Right? I think we're moving towards a 2% target. Now we're above 3% again. That's the fear. That's the problem. And the Fed doesn't have a lot of tools to handle this situation. They just don't. I think we need to turn to Congress. We need to turn to the president, the federal government in Washington, D.C. to start to think about how fiscal policy and how different government policies can help address this issue.
Appreciate your insight as always, Orfe. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. If you missed some of today's show, you can find it wherever you find podcasts. I'm Chris Krug. On behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation, thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.